You know, there are a number of exclusive communities around. There are organizations with membership dues that are designed to exclude and include. And there are walls and divisions, and there's two little towns in East Texas. I won't call the names of them, but you may know them. They're separated by about 6 miles and separated by centuries from a racial standpoint. In the little town where I grew up, there was a literal railroad track that separated parts of society. And of course, we've also got plenty of border walls around. We've got lots of walls. We've got lots of divisions. We as a society and as a people, maybe we like those things. Maybe those are things that we think we need. And no matter where you look in any society, there seems to always be a gate between the rich and the poor, between the insiders and the outsiders, between those who feast and those who hunger. And that's exactly the picture that Jesus points or paints for us today in the gospel lesson. He tells the story of these 2 men who live on opposite sides of a gate. On one side, the rich man lives in splendor. He's dressed in purple and fine linen. The designer suits and custom tailoring of his day, that's the norm for him. Every day is a feast, not just on the Sabbath or on the festival days or the high holy days. He eats like it's Thanksgiving every day. And on the other side of the gate lies the only man in all of Jesus' parables that he calls by name. His name is Lazarus. And he's dressed not in linen but in sores, and he's covered not in perfume, but, forgive me for being a little graphic, but covered in dog spit. He's hungry. He longs for the crumbs from the rich man's table, but the table is on the other side of the gate. And so Lazarus suffers while the rich man feasts. Now, this story is kind of uncomfortable. And sometimes it's a little bit too familiar to our own lives. We know what poverty is, and we recognize. In fact, the United States government defined poverty in about 3 years ago as persons living with a maximum annual income of $13,950. That was the official gate that separated rich from poor. Now, by that measure, I'm pretty rich. I guess we all are. And when I read today's gospel, it gets a little, you get a little twitchy about that, because there is a separation there. But I think that's what Jesus intends, although I don't think, and oftentimes we read this one and we think, it's about money. But this parable is not about income. Not at all. It's about indifference. And we want to be careful, because God is not rewarding the poor and punishing the wealthy based on a dollar amount. If that was the case, then we would all just need to reduce our income to $13,499.99, and we'd be blessed incredibly. That's not the point in this. Nobody's signing up for that plan anyway, I don't think. And besides, the world doesn't need more poverty. The gospel is not about creating more Lazaruses lying at the gate, because the rich man's sin was not his wealth, it was his indifference. He saw Lazarus every day, and every day he walked past likely, and he knew Lazarus' name even, and yet he treated him like a piece of cast-out furniture, like a piece of the scenery. Now, it's important to remember that in this parable, wealth is not condemned. It's what's condemned is blindness to the suffering of others. And that's a message that should make us all squirm, just a little. And then comes this great divide. The story takes a huge turn. Both men die. And in death, everything is reversed. Lazarus, who suffered outside the gate, is carried by angels to Abraham's side. He's finally at the banquet table, embraced by the father of his faith, Father Abraham. The rich man who feasted every day now finds himself in torment. He's thirsty, anxious for even a single drop of water. And the one who was last before is now first. That sound familiar? The one who was invisible is now honored. And the one who is honored is pretty much forgotten. And there's a striking detail in that, and I alluded to it a little bit, but Lazarus is given a name in this parable. The rich man is not. In life, everyone knew the rich man's name. They knew who he was. He was important. He mattered. But in God's story, it's Lazarus whose name is remembered. For too many people, oftentimes in that setting, the gates and the walls that we build become chasms, become divides. And when the rich man begs for relief, Abraham says, well, between us and you is a great chasm. That great divide didn't suddenly appear at death. It had been there all along. The gate that separated Lazarus and the rich man in life had become this great divide that separated them once they died. And that's what Jesus is warning us about. The gates that we build today, the divides that we build today, harden and grow into eternal chasms. I remember, any of y'all remember the TV show The Flintstones? Yeah. Well, in one of those episodes, or maybe I dreamed this, but it seems to fit. And I think when I thought of this, I thought, yeah, that was the Flintstones. They go on vacation. This is Fred and Wilma and what was the little girl's name? Pebbles, yeah, Pebbles. They go to visit the Grand Canyon, and it's just a creek. You know, you get it? Those small things can become big things in our lives. And we know those gates. We know those divides. They show up in all kinds of ways. There's certainly rich versus poor. There's black versus white. There's immigrant versus citizen. Christian versus Muslim. Democrat and Republican. I know we don't have any of that around here. And neighbors versus strangers. Those divides are real. But the real problem is not the categories. It's the hearts. The gates that we build and the divides that we create are reflections of what we have inside. And the tragedy of the rich man is not that he ignored Lazarus necessarily. The tragedy is that he had locked this gate around his own heart. And it became a prison for him, one that he could not escape. Sadly for the rich man, even in death, though, he's still blind. There's something even more chilling. Even in torment, the rich man doesn't see Lazarus as a brother. He doesn't speak to Lazarus. Now, he sees Abraham and Lazarus, but he doesn't speak to Lazarus. He treats him like a servant. Even then, he says, send Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and cool my tongue. Even in Hades, he hasn't learned to love. He hasn't learned to recognize that that's his brother. He still thinks in terms of privilege and rank and entitlement. Now, here's the warning. And maybe it's more an encouragement, too. But the time to learn to love is now. We don't get to postpone it to eternity. If we don't learn it here, we won't learn it later on. In his desperation, the rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus to his 5 brothers, and Abraham says, no, they've got enough information. They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. In other words, they already know intellectually how to treat others. The scriptures are clear. Love your neighbor. Care for the poor. Do justice. Show mercy. And the rich man argues and says, no. If someone rises from the dead, then they'll believe. And Abraham says, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And of course, you know how that ultimately plays out. Jesus did rise from the dead, and many still refused and refuse to believe. The problem is not a lack of evidence, it's a lack of love. But this story is a warning in some ways, but also it's an encouragement and a promise. It reminds us that God sees the Lazaruses of this world. And you remember what I said earlier? This is the only parable where Jesus gives someone a name. And the name Lazarus means literally God has helped. That's the promise. God helps the poor, the forgotten, the overlooked, and God knows their names even when the world forgets them, and God will lift them up. The encouragement in that is, thank you. That's, as a church, that is probably the thing that we do best, is recognize those that are on the outside of the gate and serve them. And so, praise God. Thanks be to God for all that you as a church do for our community. Because that's not, sadly, the norm. There are many that feel invisible or unloved or unwanted. And they should take comfort in this story, because one of the messages in this story is that they're not forgotten. God knows their name. And I know many of you know many of the people's name. We had a young lady in the foyer earlier. We all know her name. And we love to see her and bless her. And she can't stay long, but to send her on her way. There are times in our lives when we need to recognize that we are literally being the hands and the feet and the voice of Jesus. Thank God for that. Because the reality is, most of us probably have more in common with the rich man than with Lazarus. And so sometimes that makes us uncomfortable. Because Jesus is telling this parable really to the Pharisees. He's telling it to shake them awake. Because just before this passage, Jesus calls the Pharisees lovers of money. And they believe wealth was a sign of God's blessing, and poverty was a sign of God's judgment. But Jesus flips this upside down, and in so doing gives us an opportunity to be Christ in people's lives. So, we all have those gates, those divides, those chasms that we recognize in our lives, those things that sometimes we're grateful that separate us from others. I would challenge you this morning challenge myself as well, to not be scared to open those gates. You do a great job of it, church. You really do. And yet still there are often gates in our own lives. Sometimes it's with family members, sometimes it's with friends that, we want to keep that distance and not love the way we should. There is the difference between Lazarus and the rich man. Lazarus's life, say that 9 times in a hurry, real quick, just in your mind. You can out loud if you need to. But Lazarus is this. There are a number of Lazarus. Okay, I can't do it. I give up. We know who those people are. We know who those people are. And his life looked empty, but yet he was carried away by God's love and God's grace. When we serve, we do that same thing. We carry folks to a point where they recognize that they are loved and they're accepted by God's grace. That's our mission. That's what makes us different from every other organization. There are lots of organizations that do great work and serve and feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and that they should. But our job, the opportunity that we have here more, is to show those people how to love, and then to practice that love with one another, to be the hands and feet of Jesus to those on the other side of the gate every opportunity that we can. Thanks be to God.